Hey there, this is Ross Izzard, and this is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in more interesting places. So we've been doing guest interviews recently. Last week we had Patrick Srebniak from Avid Max. Avid Max, as you all know now, is my favorite and my local fly shop here in Denver. Been using them for years to buy everything from waders to rods to reels to fly line. Patrick and I had a pretty long discussion about the fly line that you might need to fly tying materials and everything else. And I love those guys. They've got a ton of selection. But really the point of the episode was not necessarily to sell you Avid Max, although you should definitely check those guys out if you're interested because they are awesome. But to kind of show you the value of finding your own good, trustworthy local fly shop, your kind of home in the fly fishing community. You don't have to have a fly shop, but having one sure helps out when you need something or you have a question or you just don't know how something works or something breaks. It never hurts to have folks you can go talk to. And plus, let's be honest, it's fun to talk about fishing. So going someplace where you can talk to other anglers is always a plus. And it gives you someplace to hang out when your significant other is mad at you or when you feel inclined to go spend some money and do some retail therapy. So hope you enjoyed that episode. I thought it was a lot of fun talking to Patrick. This week, you're back with just me, yours truly. We've got a couple episodes left in this season. We have one more interview for you, this time with a guy named Dave Arnett, who is with Douglas County Search and Rescue, who talks to us about how to stay safe and how that crazy search and rescue thing works. He will be on with us next week. This week, you'll be hanging out with me. The week after Dave, you'll be hanging out with me. And then we're going to kind of call it a day on this first season. We're going to wrap it up. I've got to go out of town for a little bit, so I won't be able to record. So we'll have a couple week break before we jump properly into season 2. But don't worry, I'm not going to leave you hanging. We will be back with season 2. And in the meantime, I'm going to give you a bonus episode about fly fishing the backcountry, or kind of not the backcountry, if we're being honest, in October. So you'll get that episode too before I head out. So you've got some tips there. And then we'll be back, and next season we'll be jumping into a whole lot more detailed information about fly fishing more generally and have a whole bunch more fun, I hope. So with all of that, today we are talking about the 10 backcountry fly fishing tips, and some of them are just fly fishing tips, but we're going to focus heavily on the backcountry that you didn't know you needed. So if you ever listened to Donald Rumsfeld talk about the known unknowns back in the days of the Iraq War, these are like your unknown unknowns. It's the stuff that you don't know and that you don't know you don't know. And so my hope is that there'll be a few items in here that will kind of raise your eyebrows and be helpful to you because you haven't thought about them before. These are things that I've kind of come up with over the years that I never thought about, didn't have any occasion to think about, but now that I know them, they make a very big difference for me. So hopefully you'll feel the same, and let's go ahead and jump right in. All right. Tip number 1 goes back to something that we have talked about for most of the season, which is, first of all, you need to carry 2 rods when you're in the backcountry. I don't care which 2 rods they are, but you do need to carry 2 rods and 2 reels when you are hiking anywhere or when you're off the beaten trail, because sooner or later you're going to break one and you're going to want a backup. So I know I'm beating that dead horse, but for real, you want to carry 2 rods or you're going to have a bad time one of these days. But when you carry 2 rods, you kind of may not want to carry both rod tubes. They're a little heavy, especially the metal tubes. They're a little unwieldy. I like to stick them down in my water bottle pocket and strap them down, as I've said before, and that works fine. But I also don't really love the weight, and they're kind of bulky, and they get hung up on, tree branches and stuff. Every now and then one of the rod tubes works its way loose. I try to strap them down tight enough that doesn't happen, but it could happen. You could drop one. And the tubes get kind of mangled. And on top of that, every now and then I'm hiking with a obviously expensive rod strapped to my pack, and it always makes me a little nervous that I'm going to leave it by a lake or by a stream somewhere, or turn my back for a second, and I'm going to come back and find out that somebody has gotten themselves a new fancy fly rod. So here's your tip. You can get kind of a junky old fly tube. You can get them at Cabela's. You can order them online, whatever. Just make sure you get a big enough one. You can actually fit 2 rods, as long as they're both 4 pieces or both 3 pieces. You can fit 2 rods into a single rod sock, and then you can just slide that single rod sock with all of the segments. And now you have 8 segments total in there down into that junky tube, And you can just carry the junky tube with you with 2 rods in it. So you don't necessarily have to deal with having 2 rod tubes strapped to you. You don't have to worry about mangling the tubes or any of the other stuff I mentioned. You just slide them down in the sock, and then you can carry that single rod tube, which in addition to being lighter, is going to be better built for being beat up because you're not going to care if it gets scratched or dirty or mangled. And just generally will buy you some room. It's always kind of amazing to me how much just little subtractions like that will buy you as far as room in your pack. So get yourself a cheap rod tube, grab your rods, put them both in the same sock, put them in that one rod tube, strap it to your back. You're ready to go. Tip number 2, also related to rod tubes. When you are hiking, and this is especially true when you're hiking over tree line at high elevations, so we're talking, 11, 11.5, 12, or even higher than that. As we've said before, there are a ton of thunderstorms up there. I mean, there are thunderstorms almost every afternoon. They can be pretty violent. If you've ever been in one of those, it's not a lot of fun. It's pretty scary. Obviously recommend that you not do that. If you can avoid it, it's far better for you not to be up there, and you should follow the rule of being back below tree line by noon. But every now and then you could get stuck in a storm. And one of the things that occurred to me rather late in my fly fishing career was that you probably don't want to be carrying metal rod tubes that are sticking a couple feet off of your back in a thunderstorm above tree line. Now, this obviously makes sense. You obviously don't want to be waving a 9-foot fly rod around there, especially a graphite rod that is going to act as a superconductor into your body. But I had never really thought about the rod tubes. And to be honest with you, I have hiked probably more often than I should down from a mountain with a thunderstorm brewing overhead, with metal rod tubes sticking up off of my back. I can hear thunder in the distance. It might not be super close. But most of you probably know that if thunder is close enough for you to hear it, then you are close enough to get struck by lightning. Some folks don't realize that, and they think, I've got some time, it's far away. No, the way that set of physics works is that if you can hear it, if the sound waves are reaching you, you can get struck by lightning, and it's probably time for you to go. But I carried metal rod tubes for a long time, and one day it occurred to me out of the blue that carrying 2 big, tall metal rod tubes on my back in a thunderstorm was not smart. So going back to that previous tip about putting both of your rods in the same sock and then putting them down into a single tube, make sure that tube is not a metal one. You're going to want to have some kind of fabric or a canvas tube or a plastic tube of some kind, but something that when it's sticking up off your back, it's not going to get struck by lightning. So there's your second safety tip related to how you carry your rods. All right, tip number 3. You need to label your fly boxes. And by label them, I mean that you should put your name and your address and your phone number on them. This is not something that I had thought about for, really ever, until I finally met somebody who does this. And I'd lived in kind of terror. It's like you're standing in the middle of a stream. You need to change flies. Maybe you got hung up in a tree and you lost them, or a fish ate them, or they're just not working. And you reach into your pack, and you've got your fly boxes. I carry 3 fly boxes. Like I said, we'll do a whole episode at some point about fly boxes because there's a lot there. But I've got 3 fly boxes, one for nymphs, one for dries, and one for streamers and wets and whatever other random stuff I need to throw in there. They are self-contained fly boxes, and they are all hand-tied. So those are all flies that I sat at a vise and tied myself. There are hundreds of flies in these boxes. I think my biggest one holds about 336 flies, and they are all full. So if I dropped those into the river, I'd be real upset, right? On top of the loss of the flies, which sucks because it would make it hard to fish, and would probably be fairly expensive to replace. I've lost all that time. I, like many fly tires, am very attached to my flies. They're not great. I'm not saying that I'm an artist, but, they work. They catch me a lot of fish. And I spend a lot of time at the vise. So I like my flies a certain way. I like them organized a certain way. And I trust them because I've been out on the water with them so often that, I have learned to trust my fly patterns. I would be devastated to lose a fly box. So like if I slipped or I stumbled or I'm just having like a Butterfinger moment and I drop that thing, it would just be gone. I mean, it would fall into the river, whether it floats or not, almost doesn't matter. It might float off before you can catch it. It could sink to the bottom and get bumped along on the bottom. But either way, it might just be gone. And that could be, man, depending on how you get your flies, That could be hundreds of dollars worth of flies that you bought. It could be hundreds of dollars worth of fly tying materials, and even worse, hundreds or dozens of hours of your life that you spent tying those things at the vise. And then they're just gone in the river. And the truth is they might be gone anyway, even if you label your fly boxes, they, get stuck in a crevice down underneath the water or, wash up somewhere where nobody's ever going to find them. And they could be gone anyway. But just in case you drop them or you leave them behind at lunch or you do something silly and leave them sitting on a log, label them. I put 2 labels on my fly boxes. One of them has my name, Ross Izzard. The next one has my phone number underneath that. And then the other one has a little note just to incentivize people and sweeten the pot. Because, a lot of folks would find that fly box and say, oh, sweet, check out this amazing assortment of free flies I just found. I put a reward on it. So the first tag on one corner of the fly box says Ross Izzard and my phone number. The next one says, I'll give you $300 or $400 or $500 to give me this box back if you find it. So, a $300 reward to return if found. Or whatever you can afford or whatever you want to do. But something to make it worth the other person's time to call you and do the right thing and give you your flies back. Now, look, I know I'm cynical. I work in politics. It happens. I can't help it. And also, I don't think I'm wrong. But, there are good people in the world that would try to get it back to you just because they're good people and they know how much it would suck to lose your fly box. There are plenty of people who would just pick that thing up and take it home with them. So giving them a little bit of extra incentive to do the right thing. It's okay for people to do the right thing for the wrong reasons, as I say often, is a good idea. So put your labels on there. You can use just normal, sticky name tag labels. So, cut them in half, write your information on 1 or on 2 or however many you want to use. It doesn't really matter how you structure it. Make sure that your fly box has a flat enough surface on it for you to stick those things to so they're not wrinkled and coming off. And then stick them on. And then grab some clear packing tape. Obviously, those name tags are not waterproof. Pen is not waterproof. Your fly boxes shouldn't be getting super duper wet all the time because your flies will rust and it's just kind of gross to have wet flies in your box. But get some clear packing tape and do a couple of layers. Make sure you cover the edges of those name tag stickers. Get a couple of things of packing tape, cover those up with a couple of layers, and just make sure that you seal up the edges and the corners. Doesn't make them perfectly waterproof, but it does make them water resistant enough that if they get wet in a rainstorm, or if you do momentarily drop one, or they get splashed, or you fall in, or whatever, they will stay dry enough that you don't have to worry about the ink sort of running off or getting smudged or destroyed, and then you have to do the whole process again. So label your fly boxes. I've never lost a fly box, but one day I could. And to be honest with you, I would probably rather lose a rod or a reel, even an expensive one, than a fly box. That would just be devastating. So think about that. If you're not doing it already, something you ought to be thinking about. Okay. Same subject as flies. Here comes tip number 4. You need to check the eyes of your flies before you go out to fish. I cannot tell you how many times I have kicked myself because I didn't check the eyes of my flies. Now, this does not matter whether you tied them or whether you bought them. If you bought them, very often those things are tied, in batches of, a gajillion somewhere in China, or even somewhere in America, and they're in a hurry. So they're tying these things up, they put a whip finish on them, and then they're just slapping head cement on that thing. And sometimes in the process of slapping head cement, and for those of you who don't know, head cement is a liquid that people very often put on the thread wraps of a fly. It dries clear and it dries hard, and the idea is that it helps make the fly a little bit more durable by keeping those final wraps in place. But very often it gets into the eye, and they'll kind of wipe it clean. I do the same thing, but there's often still some head cement left in those fly eyes. And when you get out there with head cement still in the fly eyes, you are going to wind up in a situation where you can't thread the fly. And so you're going to be standing on the river trying to thread your fly. Maybe it's a size 20 something and you're trying to put 5X or 6X down through that hole. It just won't work. And you're sitting there and you're pushing and the tippet just keeps on folding over and giving out. And it's because the eye is blocked. Now, you should have a tool with you that can deal with that. It could just be a safety pin that you keep in your fly bag. It could be a pair of forceps that has those little, that sharp little post on them that you can use to clear a blocked eye or a crowded eye. You should have a tool to deal with it because eventually you are going to have to deal with it. But man, it's way better to just not have to deal with it. And the same goes for the flies that you tie at home. So, very often I will crowd the eyes of my flies. I shouldn't do it. I know better. I've been doing it for a long time, but I still crowd the eye. And that means that I tie too close to the eye, and there's either head cement in the eye hole, or the thread wraps are kind of partially covering the eye, or the hackle is in the way, or something is going on that makes that fly tough to thread. And then you're going to get out there and you're going to be looking at this rising trout and you just, God, I cannot get this thing on. And it's going to drive you nuts. And sometimes it means that you're not going to be able to use your flies, which is a waste of time and a waste of money. So make sure that you check those eyes before you go. And when I say check the eyes, here's what I mean. I mean, sit down with each individual fly before it goes in your box. So whether you bought those things and they're in a little cup from the shop, or whether you tied them and they are just kind of sitting on a magnet pad or wherever you put them before they go in your box, take each individual one, get a small safety pin, about the smallest safety pin that you can get. I don't know the exact size, but I bought a box of like 500 of these on Amazon for maybe $5. Open that safety pin and stick the tip of that safety pin down through the eye of the fly until you can see the tip on the other side. That will make sure that if there's any gunk or glue or head cement or anything else in that eye, that it's out of the way and that you can go ahead and fish it. If there is something really in the way, like thread wraps, you really crowded it, you tied it wrong, which, as I said, I do often, that will tell you whether or not you're going to be able to fish the fly. And you can kind of poke and prod and see, but if you're having trouble getting that safety pin through the eye because of the thread or anything else, you're going to know that fly just might not maybe work very well for you. And if you want to double check, you can keep a strand of whatever your favorite tippet is. I believe it should be 5X tippet. I am somewhat of the opinion that there is no other tippet that you need for 98% of fly fishing, but we'll talk about tippet in another episode. But I'll keep just a short little strand of leftover tippet from a dry dropper rig or some kind of waste or whatever. And I'll just sit there. I'll thread it right there on the vise, or right there in my hand. I'm not going to tie the knot. I just want to see that the tippet can fit through the eye, because really I don't want to get out there and not be able to tie the damn thing on. Hard enough to tie knots in a lot of conditions anyway, and you don't need an extra problem there. So check your flies before they go in your box. You're going to be happy that you did. Tip number 5, also related to tying on your flies: take off your polarized sunglasses. So you got to wear polarized sunglasses. We've talked about this before. Mine here in Colorado are amber polarized, which means the lenses are kind of this amber color, which works really well for our water out here. It kind of matches well with the spectrum that we're dealing with on our streams and at least some of our lakes. And they help a lot. Polarized glasses take a lot of the glare off the water. They allow you to see more deeply and more clearly into the water so that you can spot the fish or see obstacles or wade better and more safely. But you should be wearing polarized glasses. But here's the thing. When you're tying on small flies with small tippets, so we're talking, size 20s and 22s and smaller with 5X, or even though I said I only like 5X, occasionally you get a fly small enough that you have to use 6X because you just can't fit the 5X through the eye hole. But when you're messing with that stuff, a lot of the time it's really tough to see the tippet. And you hear guys all the time online and elsewhere talk about the fact that, the tippet's basically invisible. I can't see it. It's like it doesn't exist. And I've been there too. I have definitely stood on the river and kind of been trying to squint and figure out where the hell that tippet was so that I could see it to get it through the eye and tie the knot. But I have found that very often one of the problems that I'm having is that I need the little bit of glare off of that fluorocarbon or that monofilament tippet to be able to see it well, especially in the sun. And so I have learned that if you just put your glasses down, take them off your face for just a second, very often that little bit of extra glare that you get back from taking the polarized glasses off will let you see the tippet better so that you can grab it, you can manipulate it, and you can tie on your flies without standing out there and squinting at them like you just got out of a home for the blind. So remember that glare is bad most of the time, but it's not bad all of the time. And if you are having trouble seeing your tippet as you're tying it on, particularly in weird light conditions, take off your sunglasses. It's going to help you see it much better. It's going to make you probably faster. And really that's the game. You want to be as fast as possible when it comes to tying these knots on, because the faster you are, the faster your flies are back in the water. And the more time your flies spend in the water, obviously the more fish you're going to catch. So remember to take off your glasses if you're having trouble seeing that tippet and tie it on. And then remember to put them back on when you're done, because you don't want to burn your eyeballs. And also because you do need those polarized glasses to fish. All right, tip number 6. Number 1, this is a 2-part tip. The first part is not going to surprise you. You need to carry a thermometer with you, a stream thermometer. So we talked about this a little bit in the Guiding Principles episode earlier this season when we were discussing how to respect the fish. But water temperatures matter for trout, and they matter in a couple of ways. Number 1, and the more dangerous way, is that if water temperatures get too high in the summer months or the early fall months, so we're talking above 68, above 70, that kind of range, you need to stop fishing. Warm water does not carry as much dissolved oxygen as cold water does. That's why trout prefer cold water. And the result of that is that if you catch a fish in that really warm water and you have a big fight with them and you put them in the net and you're messing with them to take pictures and all the rest of it, that fish doesn't have the oxygen in the water to recover correctly. So the analogy I gave last time is that you have a fight with Mike Tyson in his prime and you come out of there just gasping for air and exhausted. And then somebody forces you onto, the side of Mount Everest where there's no oxygen and expects you to recover that way. You might not recover that way. And it's even worse for the trout because they are in moving water, where if they can't get their balance back and they don't have the strength and the sort of gas in their tank to hold with the current to get back in a position, they're going to get washed down the river and battered on the rocks and stabbed with sticks and logs and all kinds of stuff. It's not a good thing. I mean, imagine how you'd feel being ragdolled down a river. And then remember, the trout don't have arms or legs to, shield themselves from that stuff. It's not good news. So you want to make sure the water's not too warm, but you also want to make sure that you know what the water temperatures are so you know how you ought to be fishing. Okay, so trout tend to be best at the way that I like to fish, which is, dry fly fishing or dry dropper fishing, stuff that's a little bit more surface oriented in water that's above 50. So we're talking, 50 degrees to that kind of 68 degree cutoff is kind of the prime time for trout. And if you can get it higher, great. 55, 60, beautiful. They're going to be active. Their metabolisms are working. They're going to be going after the stuff that you're putting in front of them. And obviously that is fun. That's what you want to do. But sometimes the water is going to be colder. So we're going to talk about this in the October episode. But water temps in these streams get pretty cold. So I was in a stream earlier this week that was running at about 44 degrees Fahrenheit when I hopped in the morning, and it topped out at about 49 once the sun hit it. That's pretty chilly, and it's chilly enough that obviously, your feet will start getting cold if you're not wearing the right gear. But it also kind of tells you something important about bug activity in the water, and it tells you something important about how you ought to be fishing the stream. And every stream is a little bit different. So knowing how one stream fishes at, say, 45 degrees is probably going to be different than the way another stream fishes at 45 degrees. And those are going to be different than the way a lake fishes at 45 degrees. But the more you take the temperature, and this should really just be part of your arsenal, walk up to the water when you first get there, take a temperature reading, take one when you get there, take one when you leave. And then just kind of keep a journal. You can either write them down or you can just keep them in your head or whatever, but try to keep track of what the water temps are, because over time it's going to start to inform how you can be successful at various times of the year and in various conditions. So carry a thermometer, but here is the real tip. You don't have to buy a super fancy, branded stream thermometer. I know you can get them. You can get the cool, and you throw them in the water and they've got the logo on them and they look super cool and they're called a stream thermometer. And they work fine. I've used those and they're great. So I don't don't get me wrong. They work just fine. But you don't have to do that. You don't have to go spend a bunch of money on that. And one of the tricks that I have taken to using, which I get laughed at for sometimes and people roll their eyes, but I use a meat thermometer. So meat thermometers are designed to be very accurate. Obviously, they need to test whether or not your steak is done or your pork is done so that you don't get, some terrible parasite or disease. They need to read pretty quickly because most people don't want to stand at their grill and, stare at the thing for 30 minutes while it tries to get a reading. And they're pretty good. And I have checked the meat thermometer that I have against several other thermometers, and it's, close, like within a half a degree, all the time. So it's just as accurate as anything else that you throw in there. It's easier to read than a mercury thermometer because you have a digital readout. Mine goes to the 10th of a degree, so I'll get a readout of, say, 47.8. And you look at it, you stick it in the water, it gives you an almost instant reading. They've got those kind of sharp metal probes on them that you use to stick into the meat. Instead of sticking it into the meat, you just stick it into the water. You get an instant reading. You can look at it, and you can just get right to fishing. You don't have to throw that thing in there and wait for the mercury to settle. You don't have to try to parse whether or not it's saying that it's 42 or 44 if it's in between the marks on the thermometer. And you can trust it. And look, if you drop it or you break it or whatever, they're not expensive. So you can just go get one and replace it in your pack. No big deal. No muss, no fuss. It doesn't really matter what kind of meat thermometer you have. I don't like the idea of having that sharp probe in my pack. So you either need to get one with a cover on it. A lot of them come with little plastic covers for that probe, or you need to get one that folds. So mine is actually a kind of big orange thermometer. The probe folds up into it. So then I just slip it down on the side of my pack. I pull it out. I unfold it and get the probe out, check the water temp, stick it right back in my pack. It's probably like a 3-second process that you should definitely be doing. And if you don't want to buy a stream thermometer and you don't want to mess with all that, just get a meat thermometer. It's going to work just fine. All right. Number 7, going back to flies and tying flies in particular. And this could be tying or buying, I guess. So, a lot of people just buy their stuff. That's fine. No hate. I know a lot of us love to tie. If you don't tie already, I really think you should. It is an amazing addition to the sport. It's a ton of fun in its own right. It's therapeutic. It's meditative. It's just a beautiful thing to do. When I get really stressed out, I love to just sit at my vise and listen to music or do whatever and just tie flies. Love doing it. But there is one problem that you have to deal with, and that is when you should tie more flies. So this comes down to personal preference. Some people are comfortable carrying like a hockey puck of flies where they have like 2 of each pattern. And they're good with that. They'll just go fish all day. I can't do that. It makes me super nervous. So for me, I like to have a dozen of each pattern in various sizes, and sometimes various colors, but I'm pretty settled on most of my colors. So we're usually talking sizes. But I like to have 12. That's a full row in my fly box. I like the way the full rows look because I'm a little bit OCD. I like the way a full fly box looks. So part of it's that. But part of it is too that sometimes I'll lose a lot of flies. These little streams, these little creeks, man, you might be getting hung up on overhead branches every 10th cast, or you might get stuck on logs or debris in the water if it's kind of dirty water. Lots of stuff can happen, and I have had days. I'll have 5 days in a row where I don't lose a single fly, and then I'll have a day where I lose 15. And it happens. And when you run out of the pattern that you need, especially if it's a pattern that's working, it's just a bad feeling. I don't like feeling like I don't have the thing that I need to catch fish, and as a result, I can be a little bit compulsive about replacing flies when I lose them. But I have had to learn over the years that you got to have a trigger number for when you start replacing flies. Doesn't really matter what the number is. Like I said, you can decide what you're comfortable with and how many you like to carry, but you have to decide that once you have lost a certain number of flies, when you get down to a number of remaining flies that has you nervous in a certain pattern, that it's time to replace them. So for me, because I tie, this would be, I have 12 flies. I will not allow myself to sit down and tie a single fly or 2 flies. In part because I got to get all my stuff out and do it. And in part because it will eventually drive you nuts. If you try to replace every individual single fly that you lose, you're going to go insane. It's a crazy game. You're going to lose flies, and it just is trust me, that way lies madness. You don't want to go there. So I will not tie new flies until I hit my personal trigger number, which is 6. I have 12 flies in the box. Once I lose 6 flies, which means I only have 6 remaining, then I will sit down and tie. And it makes it easier for me because I don't have to stress about, man, I lost 2 today. I got to sit down and tie 2 Prince Nymphs, and then I'm going to sit down and tie 3 Hare's Ears, and then I'm going to tie 1 pair of Shoot Adams, and then I'm going to tie 1 Clink Hammer. You can sort of set it so that you're tying a whole bunch of them at one time. You get all the materials out in front of you. The flies tend to be a lot more consistent. So if you can tie 6 in a row, those flies are going to come out probably looking better and more consistent than they would if you tied them, one at a time over 6 sessions. And it just allows you to kind of focus. You tie faster, I think, when you're focusing on just banging out one pattern. And so for me, my trigger number is 6. It might be 2 for you. It might be 4, whatever you decide. But pick a number for yourself and do that. Same goes for buying flies. If you're buying your flies and let's say you have the same box with a 12 fly row in it and you lose one fly, you probably don't want to go buy or order one more fly. Maybe you have to pay for shipping. Maybe it's a pain and you're burning gas money to go to the fly shop to go buy that thing. You probably want to have a trigger number. So decide even when you're buying, like, okay, when I only have 4 flies left, now it's time for me to go buy more flies of this pattern. And it'll help just ease your stress. Otherwise, you're going to get caught up in this completely insane game of trying to keep your fly boxes full at all times. And man, it's not helpful. That level of OCD is not helpful. I've been there. I've been that guy. It's not going to do you any good. Set your trigger number and only tie or buy when you get to that trigger number. Okay. Tip number 8. When you are walking down a steep hill, so let's say that this is like an access to a river that happens to be down in a gully or a ravine or a canyon. Those of you who have fished in canyons, you know that very often there's a trail kind of, 20 or 30 yards up on the canyon wall. And then if you want to access the water, you have to kind of scramble or slide down this pretty steep hill to the edge where you can access it. Sometimes there are little fisherman's trails that'll get you down there. Very often there are not, and you just have to kind of work your way down. Those slopes are almost always covered with loose scree and rocks and gravel and branches and stuff that you're going to slip on. Sometimes they're covered in snow in the wintertime. So a lot of stuff to slip on, a lot of stuff to trip on. And eventually you're going to fall. You just are. I hate to tell you that. I try not to. Obviously falling, especially in the backcountry, is bad news, in part because it hurts and in part because you could get hurt, and then be in a potentially bad situation. So be safe, that first guiding principle. But the other thing that can happen when you fall is that you can break your fly rod. You should have a backup with you anyway, as we said before. But you could fall. You could drop your fly rod. You could throw your fly rod, as I've done before. You could smack your fly rod on the ground when you put your hand down on the slope and break it that way, or cause a weakness in the blank that could break later if you get a big fish or you get stuck on a snag or whatever. And so how you carry your fly rod down one of those slopes matters. A lot of people don't think about this, but when you are going down a slope, you're almost certainly going to turn your body left or right, so you're kind of bladed. That gives you better surface area on your feet, so you're using sort of your whole foot to be able to dig in and provide some traction for you, as opposed to just having your toes pointed straight downhill and having to deal with that much smaller area by your toes. And also it's just human instinct, because you're going to want to use your uphill arm to grab rocks and do whatever else you need to do to stabilize yourself, put your hand down, whatever you need to do to keep your balance. Because of that, you want to put your fly rod in your downhill hand. I know that seems counterintuitive, seems like downhill would be worse, but if you fall on one of these slopes, you are going to put your uphill hand down to catch yourself. You just are. It's a natural instinct. You aren't going to be able to stop yourself. You're going to put that hand down. It is very likely to be the first thing that makes contact with the ground. And if your fly rod is in that hand, you might break it. You very well could. I have done this before. You could break your fly rod by smacking it on a rock or whatever. You want to put that fly rod in your downhill hand so that if you fall, your uphill hand is available to post and to get you stable again. And your fly rod is safely in your downhill hand, which, unless you pitched over, kind of head over heels, which you really don't want to do, because then you're going to be really hurt and be in big trouble. That fly rod's going to be perfectly safe in your downhill hand. You can stop your fall, stop the slide. And when you get up, you're still going to have your fly rod. It's still going to work, and you're still going to be ready to fish. So use this when you're going down those sort of access areas to the river itself, but also if you're walking across a steep slope anyway, like some trails cross fairly steep sections where you're kind of having to lean a little bit to keep your balance. If you're off trail, you're going to run across a lot of pretty steep stuff that you need to move across. that's going to require you to lean and sort of find your traction on these steep hillsides. In all of those cases, put your fly rod in your downhill hand. And if it changes, if you switch directions, put it in the other hand. But make sure that that fly rod is always downhill. And I promise you will have a much better time. You're much less likely to break the rod. All right. Tip number 9. Let's say that you get snagged in the river. And this happens a lot. Anybody who's ever been fly fishing, you know how this goes. You throw a beautiful cast in this kind of tight pocket, and you try to pull the flies out before they hit those ominous looking branches at the end of the pocket, but you don't quite get them out. They get stuck in the log or in the branch. Or maybe they get stuck in a rock, or they get wedged between 2 rocks down on the bottom. Your dropper gets wedged or something like that. You're going to get snagged. It's just going to happen. It happens more when you're nymphing, because you're obviously trying to get your flies closer to the bottom. But it'll happen even when you're doing a dry dropper, particularly on these sort of low and clear freestone streams, and particularly in the fall when they're really extra low and clear. You're going to get snagged, and you have 3 options when you get snagged. The first one is that you can wade over and get your flies. I do that pretty often because like I said, I hate losing flies. I don't like the idea that a bad cast could cost me 10 minutes of my life at the vise. So I'll often just go get them, but with the understanding that when you walk in there, into that pool or into that pocket, you're blowing up the fish's apartment. You're not going to catch those fish. They've seen your legs. You did the Godzilla thing in front of them. They're probably done eating at that point. So you can do that. You can break it off. And I know a lot of guys who do this too. They just sort of casually point their rod straight at it. They grab the line, they pull. Obviously, tippet is pretty strong when it has the bend in the rod to support it and to protect it. But if you just pull straight on the line with no extra support from the rod, it's going to snap right away. I mean, a lot of these are like 4.5 pound tippets, or even less. They're going to break super easily, and you are going to lose your flies. And that's okay if you just want to be quick, or it's in an area that's not safe to access, or whatever the reason might be. Nothing wrong with it. Sometimes you can't get your flies back and you got to break them off, and that just is what it is. I don't like leaving them out there. I obviously hate having to do it, but it will happen to you. So that's option 2. Option 3 is to get clever. So you think about the physics of this. You threw your cast upstream, I hope, because you should always be fishing upstream, right? But you threw it upstream and it floated back towards you. And then the hook got buried in whatever this thing is, flowing down the river, coming downstream in the river. That means that hook is very likely buried in such a way that pulling in the same direction, pulling at the same angle, is not going to get it out. So this is where you see guys on the river who get sort of stuck, and then they start ripping and tearing and pulling and yanking. Number 1, you can break your rod doing that. Once again, I've broken a lot of rods, and one of the ways I've broken my rods is being angry and pulling on a snag. Don't do that. But number 2, from a physics perspective, it's not going to work. Guys, you're not going to get your flies back that way. It can't, because the hook tip is buried in it at an angle where when you pull at that same angle, you're just driving it deeper into the log. So think about a fish. Like a fish eats it, and you pull at that angle downstream to set the hook in the fish's mouth. You're pulling in that direction because it sets the hook in the fish's mouth. It actually drives it deeper into their mouth. If it's in a log, it's the same thing. You're setting the hook into the log, and you were making it less likely that you were going to get your flies back. So don't do that. That's not a good option. But here's the tip. What you can do is roll cast over that obstacle to try to get a different angle. We're going to have an episode about casting next season, but for anybody who doesn't know, a roll cast is a type of fly cast that does not involve a back cast, where instead you are basically creating a D loop in your fly line, and then you are sort of flicking it out or rolling it out across the surface of the water to your target. And when you see these things, they're pretty crazy. You can go look them up on YouTube, and like I said, we'll talk about them more later on. But they're pretty crazy to watch. I mean, it looks like you have a bunch of fly line on the water, you pull the rod back, you snap it back, and you watch it kind of unroll in a big loop out to where it needs to go. That's helpful for a lot of reasons. You can use it if you don't have a back cast. You can use it if you're trying to make a particularly tricky cast. And there's a lot of reasons you might want to roll cast. But in this case, what a roll cast does for you is it creates a force vector, so momentum, in the opposite direction of the snag. So if you roll cast over that log that you're stuck in so that the line is sort of rolling out over the log, at the end of that rollout, it is going to pull the hook in the opposite direction of the snag. It's going to pull the hook upstream, which is what you need. And I have found very often that even really stubborn snags, you can roll cast over the obstacle. You might have to do it, 3, 4, 5 times. But if you can roll cast effectively over that thing, get your line on the other side of the obstacle and make that loop unroll so that it is pulling the hook point upstream and away from the obstacle rather than downstream and into it, you'll very often get your flies back. And I've done this before and people said, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. I've been stuck forever. And it's, yeah, because it's just physics, right? You pull the hook out the opposite direction, the same way you take it out of a fish's mouth. You don't try to push it deeper. You back it out in the direction of the hook bend. It's the same thing you're doing with this roll cast, and it will, in a lot of cases, get you your flies back. And then I'll mention just one last thing on that. Of course, you can always just wade over and get your flies by going upstream of them. So you can either go over and pick them up with just your hands, or you can wade and get a different angle slightly upstream and get them back that way. That works too. But in some cases, you can't do that. And if you do that, it may mean that you're spooking a big pocket of fish up above wherever you're snagged. And that's obviously not ideal. So try roll casting if you get snagged. It may save you some flies and you'll look pretty cool doing it. All right. The last tip number 10, is what you say when somebody asks you how the fishing was. So I spend a lot of time hiking. Obviously, that's how we get into the backcountry. And one of my pet peeves, I'm just going to tell you this up front, guys. One of my pet peeves is walking down the trail, usually on the way back at the end of the day. So it's late and I'm kind of tired and I probably had a pretty good day, but I'm ready to get out of there. I'm ready to go home, or get back to camp or whatever I happen to be doing. And I'll walk by, some number of people who are going up, late in the afternoon. I never know why they're going up late in the afternoon. I always find it interesting that these people are hiking up like as the sun's going down with very little water and no flashlights and stuff like that. So I maybe don't be those people, but whatever they happen to be doing, because I have fishing stuff sticking off of my backpack. I have the rod tubes that we talked about earlier. I have my net. The question that I get asked most often is, did you catch anything? How'd you do? Were there any fish in there? What'd you catch? Things like that. And they're just trying to be nice. I know they're just trying to make conversation, and I know that I'm grumpy. We're going to go do a whole episode one of these days of just like grumpy Ross stuff. Things that are just not even logical, but they irritate me. This is one of those things. When you're hiking down after a long day of fishing and you're tired and every other person that you meet says, did you catch anything? Did you catch anything? How'd you do? It just kind of starts to drive me nuts. But I don't want to be rude, so I don't just walk past them. But I'm also not necessarily going to tell them the truth, right? Because some of those people might be going up there to fish. They might be going up there to camp. They might be, telling their friends about what they're doing or whatever. And I don't necessarily, like, if I caught 40 fish in there, or, I caught the biggest cutthroat I've ever seen in a lake, or it was the best fishing I've had all summer, I don't necessarily want to tell them that. I know that's kind of gatekeepy, and some people are going to be, well, you shouldn't do that. It's public land. Everybody's, I know. And I don't disagree. But here's the thing. I found all of these places on my own. I didn't have anybody hand them to me on a silver platter. I don't ask people for their fishing spots. I read books. I go online. I look at maps. I look at stocking reports. I look at all the stuff that you need to plan trips. And then I go. And sometimes I get it right and there are fish there. And sometimes I get it wrong and there aren't. But I don't ever ask people to burn their spots for me. And the truth is, a lot of these far off places are still pretty wild. We're talking like alpine tundra or wetlands or canyon lands that are pretty pristine. And those areas are pretty sensitive. If you start putting 100 people through there every other day, they're just not going to be able to sustain it. They're not. And the truth is that a lot of these folks, because they have not taken the time under our other guiding principle, which is that understanding equals enjoyment, they have not taken the time to understand these places. They have not taken the time to learn about our second guiding principle, which is leave no trace. They just don't know how to take care of them. And I do not want to encourage them to show back up with 5 of their buddies, next week or 2 weeks later, leave beer bottles around, rip stuff up, start fires that they're not supposed to start, leave trash up there, throw stuff in the water, whatever it might be. I have seen that happen so many times. There's even a philosophical concept for it called tragedy of the commons. You can go look it up. But it's a tricky thing. A lot of these places are sensitive, and I just don't want people up there who aren't going to take good care of them. I really don't. And I find that there is a strong correlation between the people that take the time to find these places themselves and learn about them and figure out how to access them, and then stewardship of the resource. So those people tend to be the people that are going to go up there, take good care of it, be respectful to the fish, be respectful to the area, be respectful to nature. That tends to be those people. The people who are spoon-fed locations by Reddit or Facebook or Instagram or some guy on the trail with a fly rod, those people, they're often not, I'm sorry, they're just often not the folks who are going to take good care of it. So in addition to not wanting to share the water, I don't really want to be handing out the keys to the kingdom to these places, because I have seen a ton of really great places get ruined, especially as the population out west starts to boom in these areas and more people are outside. But then the other side's also true. So let's say I had a terrible day and I got skunked, or I caught like one fish, and I'm just kind of salty about it. In those cases, I don't really want to tell you that either. Like, let's be real. I don't want to be like, no, man, I got skunked. I didn't catch anything. I'm a shitty fly fisherman and I feel real bad about myself. I don't want to say that to somebody on the trail. And I also know that if I do say that, one of two things is going to happen. They're either going to go, oh, keep after it, sport. It'll be better for you next time. Or they're going to try to give me advice. So I've had several people, I'm like, man, it was a little bit slow. And they want to stop me and say, well, what you need to think about is, and then they will regale me with fly fishing knowledge, which I can only think of one instance where an old guy on a trail gave me what I would consider to be really valuable insights into fly fishing. And that was great. The other, 200 interactions that I've had just over the last couple of years, they don't work and they don't make sense. And to be honest with you, like, I fish the way that I fish, been doing this for a while. Yeah, I can always learn. I'm not saying that I'm perfect at it. I'm not even saying necessarily that I'm good at it, but I know how to fly fish. And if I'm getting skunked, I've probably tried everything that you're going to tell me about. And I really, at this point, just don't want to talk about it. And so I don't want to tell them that either. So here is your tip. When you are coming down a trail and somebody looks at you, or maybe it's when you get home and they're like, hey, how'd you do, man? Did you catch anything? Or whatever it happens to be. When someone asks you how you did, the answer is always, I did all right. That's always the answer. It doesn't matter if you caught 1 fish or 5 fish or 10 fish or 110 fish. You did all right. You look them right in the eye, you smile, you nod, and you say, yeah, I did all right. And that's it. They usually will not ask follow-up questions from there. They typically just go, okay, cool, man, right on, and carry on with their business. If you got skunked, they never know. Now they think that you're a badass fisherman who caught all the fish. If you happen to have found this incredible spot up there, they're going to take it to mean that the fishing is kind of so-so, it's all right. And probably kind of put them off going up there unless they're the hardcore types who really want to go see for themselves, in which case, cool, you're welcome to go up there. But if you're the casual guy who's going to go throw, treble hooks on a spin rod at these fish and then leave your beer bottle on the side, I don't know. I don't know if you need to be up there. But the answer is always, I did all right. Remember that. No matter what happened that day, you did all right. You're going to be happier for it. You're not going to have to tell people your secrets. Nobody's going to know if you got skunked. And you can just carry on with your business without having to have a big conversation with, person number 1,382 who wants to talk to you about fishing and what you could have done differently. So you did all right. And speaking of that, I think that we did all right on this tips episode. That was number 10. We are all done here. I actually have a lot more of these, so we will probably do another episode of tips you didn't know you needed at some point here in the future. But for now, I wanted to just kind of have a download of stuff that I hadn't thought about, or at least not thought deeply about, that has been helpful to me and that could be helpful to you. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you came away with at least a couple of things that are new to you. And I hope you have a great week. Stay safe out there. Till next time, this is Ross. Maybe I'll see you out there. But hopefully not.